1999 to 2021 The U.S. War in Afghanistan. 1. The U.S. War in Afghanistan 1999 to 2021. The Taliban surged back to power 2 decades after U.S.-led forces toppled their regime in what led to the United States' longest war. October 15, 1999 in Al-Qaeda-Taliban nexus. The UN Security Council adopts Resolution 1267, creating the so-called Al-Qaeda and Taliban Sanctions Committee, which links the two groups as terrorist entities and imposes sanctions on their funding, travel, and arms shipments. The UN move follows a period of ascendancy for Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden, who guided the terror group from Afghanistan and Peshawar, Pakistan, in the late 1980s, to Sudan in 1991. And back to Afghanistan in the mid-1990s. The Taliban, which rose from the ashes of Afghanistan's post-Soviet civil war, provide Al-Qaeda's sanctuary for operations. September 9, 2001, a Northern Alliance assassination. Ahmad Shah Massoud, commander of the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban coalition, is assassinated by Al-Qaeda operatives. The killing of Massoud, a master of guerrilla warfare known as the Lion of the Panjshir, deals a serious blow to the anti-Taliban resistance. Terrorism experts believe his assassination assured bin Laden protection by the Taliban after the 9/11 attacks. Expert Peter Bergen later calls Massoud's assassination the curtain raiser for the attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. Sound 26.1, August 30, 2021, 20-year war ends as U.S. completes withdrawal. The last U.S. military forces depart Afghanistan, leaving it under Taliban rule. The exit follows a chaotic, 2-week withdrawal process during which more than 120,000 people are evacuated. The next day, President Biden says the United States should learn from its mistakes and that the withdrawal marks the end of an era of major military operations to remake other countries. Thousands of Afghans who assisted the United States and its allies, as well as up to 200 Americans, remain in Afghanistan. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Washington will work to get them out and that future U.S. engagement in Afghanistan will focus on diplomacy. Sound 25.1, August 16, 2021, Biden defends withdrawal. President Biden says his administration made the right decision in ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan, arguing that the U.S. counterterrorism mission is complete. But he acknowledges that the troop withdrawal has been messy and blames Afghan security forces for failing to counter the Taliban. Meanwhile, the United States deploys 6,000 troops to evacuate U.S. and allied personnel and secure Kabul's international airport, where chaos erupts as thousands of Afghans attempt to flee. Biden says the military will help evacuate thousands of Afghans who work with the United States, and he expands refugee status access for vulnerable Afghans. Sound 26, August 26, 2021, 13 U.S. service members killed amid scramble to withdraw. 13 U.S. service members are killed and at least 18 are injured in an attack at a checkpoint outside the Kabul airport, where thousands of people are being evacuated. They are the first U.S. service members killed in action in Afghanistan since February 2020. At least 170 Afghans are also killed. The Islamic State in Khorasan claims responsibility, and several days after, the United States launches an airstrike targeting a suspected plotter from the group. However, the Pentagon later admits that the strike was a mistake and killed 10 civilians, including 7 children. Sound 24.1, April 14, 2021, Biden decides on complete U.S. withdrawal by September 11. President Biden announces that the United States will not meet the deadline set under the U.S. Taliban agreement to withdraw all troops by May 1 and instead releases a plan for a full withdrawal by September 11, 2021. It's time to end America's longest war, he says. The remaining 3,500 troops in Afghanistan will be withdrawn regardless of whether progress is made in intra-Afghan peace talks or the Taliban reduce their attacks on Afghan security forces and citizens. NATO troops in Afghanistan will also leave. Biden says Washington will continue to assist Afghan security forces and support the peace process. The Taliban say they will not participate in any conference on Afghanistan's future until all foreign troops leave. Sound 25, August 15, 2021, Afghan government collapses as the Taliban take Kabul, facing little resistance. Taliban fighters overrun the capital, Kabul, and take over the presidential palace hours after President Ghani leaves the country. Taliban leaders say they will hold talks with Afghan officials to form an open, inclusive Islamic government. Former Afghan President Karzai and Abdullah, formerly the chief executive under Ghani, create a council to facilitate a peaceful transition to a Taliban government. The takeover follows the Taliban's rapid advance, during which they captured all but two of Afghanistan's provincial capitals and seized border crossings. Afghan security forces in some areas reportedly negotiated surrenders and avoided fighting the Taliban. Sound 23.1, September 12, 2020, intra-Afghan peace talks begin. Representatives of the Taliban and of the Afghan government and civil society meet face-to-face for the first time in Doha, Qatar, after nearly 20 years of war. The direct negotiations, which were delayed for months over a prisoner swap proposed in the earlier US Taliban deal, begin after the Afghan government completes the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners. During opening remarks, both sides express eagerness to bring peace to Afghanistan and establish a framework for Afghan society after US troops withdraw. The government pushes for a ceasefire, while the Taliban reiterate their call for the country to be governed through an Islamic system. Sound 24, November 17, 2020, U.S. announces troop withdrawal. Acting U.S. Defense Secretary Christopher C. Miller announces plans to have the number of troops in Afghanistan to 2,500 by mid-January, days before President-elect Joe Biden will be inaugurated. Thousands of troops had already been pulled out following an agreement with the Taliban in February, moving closer to fulfilling President Trump's campaign promise to end the so-called forever wars. The announcement comes as negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban are deadlocked and the militant group continues to launch deadly attacks. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warns that withdrawing troops too early could allow Afghanistan to become a haven for terrorists and the Islamic State to rebuild its caliphate. Sound 22.1, September 7, 2019, Trump calls off peace talks. President Trump abruptly breaks off peace talks a week after top U.S. negotiator Khalilzad announced that an agreement had been reached in principle with Taliban leaders. In a tweet, Trump says he canceled a secret meeting with the Taliban and Afghan President Ghani at Camp David after a U.S. soldier was killed in a Taliban attack. The Taliban say they are committed to continuing negotiations, but warn that the cancellation will cause an increase in the number of deaths. Sound 23, February 29, 2020, U.S. Taliban signed deal on path to peace. U.S. envoy Khalilzad and the Taliban's Baradar sign an agreement, PDF, that paves the way for a significant drawdown of U.S. troops in Afghanistan and includes guarantees from the Taliban that the country will not be used for terrorist activities. The deal says intra-Afghan negotiations should begin the following month, but Afghan President Ghani says the Taliban must meet his government's own conditions before it enters talks. The U.S. Taliban deal doesn't call for an immediate ceasefire, and in the days after its signing, Taliban fighters carry out dozens of attacks on Afghan security forces. U.S. forces respond with an airstrike against the Taliban in the southern province of Helmand. Sound 21.1, January 2018, Taliban launch major attacks amid U.S. escalation. The Taliban carry out a series of bold terror attacks in Kabul that kill more than 115 people amid a broader upsurge in violence. The attacks come as the Trump administration implements its Afghanistan plan, deploying troops across rural Afghanistan to advise Afghan brigades and launching airstrikes against opium labs to try to decimate the Taliban's finances. The administration also cuts off security assistance worth billions of dollars to Pakistan for what President Trump called its lies and deceit in harboring Taliban militants. Critics of the national unity government say domestic politics, notably a showdown with a provincial governor, have distracted Afghan President Ghani from security. Sound 22, February 2019, U.S. Taliban peace talks progress. Negotiations between the United States and the Taliban in Doha enter their highest level yet, building on momentum that began in late 2018. The talks between U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad and top Taliban official Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar center on the United States withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan in exchange for the Taliban pledging to block international terrorist groups from operating on Afghan soil. The ramped-up diplomacy follows signals that President Trump plans to pull out 7,000 troops, about half the total U.S. deployment. Khalilzad says the United States will insist that the Taliban agree to participate in an intra-Afghan dialogue on the country's political structure, as well as a ceasefire. It is unclear whether Trump will condition the troop withdrawal on those terms. Sound 21, April 13, 2017, U.S. attacks Islamic State redoubt. The United States drops its most powerful non-nuclear bomb on suspected self-proclaimed Islamic State militants at a cave complex in eastern Nangarhar province. The weapon, known colloquially as the mother of all bombs, comes as newly elected President Donald Trump delegates decision-making authorities to commanders, including the possibility of adding several thousand U.S. troops to the nearly 9,000 already deployed there. There are about as many U.S. contractors as well. The bombing casts a spotlight on the emergence of the Islamic State in Afghanistan. At the same time, the Taliban appear to be as strong as ever. And the U.S. military describes the war as a stalemate. Kabul experiences suicide bombings, PDF, on a scale never before seen, while the Taliban control or contest more than a third, PDF, of the country. U.S. Marines are once again dispatched to Helmand Province, August 21, 2017. Trump signals prolonged Afghan war. President Trump outlines his Afghanistan policy in an address to troops in Arlington, Virginia, saying that though his original instinct was to pull out, he will instead press ahead with an open-ended military commitment to prevent the emergence of a vacuum for terrorists. Differentiating his policy from Obama's, Trump says decisions about withdrawal will be based on conditions on the ground, rather than arbitrary timelines. He invites India to play a greater role in rebuilding Afghanistan while castigating Pakistan for harboring insurgents. He also pledges to loosen restrictions on combat even as the United Nations reports an uptick, PDF, in civilian casualties caused by Afghan and coalition airstrikes. A political settlement with the Taliban, Trump says, is far off. Sound 20, May 27, 2014, Obama announces U.S. troop withdrawal. President Obama announces a timetable for withdrawing most U.S. forces from Afghanistan by the end of 2016. The first phase of his plan calls for 9,800 U.S. troops to remain after the combat mission concludes at the end of 2014, limited to training Afghan forces and conducting operations against the remnants of al-Qaeda. Obama says the drawdown will free resources for counter-terrorism priorities elsewhere. Some analysts point to the insurgency's resilience and question the plan's rigidity. Both candidates vying to succeed Afghan President Karzai have promised to sign the security agreement that is a prerequisite of any post-2014 U.S. troop presence. September 21, 2014, Ghani, Abdullah agreed to unity government. Newly elected Afghan President Ghani signs a power-sharing agreement with his chief opponent, Abdullah, who had mobilized thousands of protesters as he challenged the voting results. The agreement, brokered after intensive diplomacy by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, establishes the role of chief executive for Abdullah. While the agreement staves off civil unrest, it ushers in protracted government dysfunction as Ghani and Abdullah tussle over their respective prerogatives, such as appointments to security posts, at a time when the Taliban are making gains in the countryside. Ghani, a former World Bank specialist, is a Pashtun from the country's south, like Karzai, but is seen by the Obama administration as a welcome change. Karzai had railed against civilian casualties in the U.S. war effort and was seen as fostering public corruption. Sound 19, March 2012, Taliban cancel talks, U.S.-Afghan tensions flare. In January, the Taliban strike a deal to open an office in Qatar, a move toward peace talks that the United States sees as a crucial part of a political settlement to ensure a stable Afghanistan. But 2 months later, the Taliban suspend preliminary talks, accusing Washington of reneging on promises to take meaningful steps toward a prisoner swap. In February, U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announces the Pentagon's plan to conclude combat missions by as early as mid-2013 and shift to a primarily security assistance role in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, several incidents serve as blows to the international mission, including an accidental burning of Qurans by U.S. troops and allegations that a U.S. soldier murdered at least 16 Afghan villagers. Afghan President Karzai demands that foreign troops be withdrawn from village outposts and confined to military bases, which analysts say would greatly accelerate the pace of transition from NATO to Afghan control. June 2013, Afghan security takeover completed. Afghan forces take the lead in security responsibility nationwide as NATO hands over control of the remaining 95 districts. The U.S.-led coalition's focus shifts to military training and special operations-driven counterterrorism. The handover occurs on the same day as the announcement that Taliban representatives and U.S. officials will resume talks in Doha, Qatar, where the Taliban have just opened an office. Afghan President Karzai, believing the office will confer legitimacy on the insurgent group and serve as a diplomatic outpost, suspends negotiations with the United States. With its mandate expiring in December 2014, the United States must negotiate a bilateral security agreement with the Karzai government to maintain a military presence. Sound 18, October 7, 2011, 10 years of war. The U.S. war in Afghanistan marks its 10th anniversary, with about 100,000 U.S. troops deployed in a counterinsurgency role, primarily in southern and eastern regions. President Obama plans to withdraw all combat troops by 2014, but serious doubts remain about the Afghan government's capacity to secure the country. Amid a resilient insurgency, U.S. goals in Afghanistan remain uncertain and terrorist safe havens in Pakistan continue to undermine U.S. efforts. A decade in, the war's tolls include 1,800 U.S. troop casualties and $444 billion in spending. The costs have eroded U.S. public support, with a global economic downturn, a 9.1% unemployment rate, and a $1.3 trillion annual budget deficit. While there are military gains, hopes for a deal with the Taliban to help wind down the conflict remain riddled with setbacks. Afghan President Karzai suspends the talks following the September 20 assassination of Burhanuddin Rabbani, the government's chief negotiator, which Afghan officials blame on the Pakistan-based Haqqani network. The group denies it. December 5, 2011, Bonn Conference. 10 years after the first international conference that discussed Afghanistan's political future, dozens of countries and organizations meet again in Bonn, Germany, to devise a roadmap of cooperation beyond the international troop withdrawal in 2014. Afghan President Karzai says the country will require $10 billion annually over the next decade to shore up security and reconstruction, and commits to tackling corruption in exchange for continued international assistance. The conference fails to achieve its objectives to lay down a blueprint for Afghanistan's transition to a self-sustaining and secure government as the insurgency continues to rage, and Pakistan, a crucial player, refuses to attend. Sound 17.1, June 22, 2011, Obama announces troop drawdown. President Obama outlines a plan to withdraw 33,000 troops by the summer of 2012, the surge troops sent in December 2009, including 10,000 by the end of 2011. Polls show a record number of Americans do not support the war, and Obama faces pressure from lawmakers, particularly Democrats, to sizably reduce U.S. forces in Afghanistan. After the surge troops leave, an estimated 70,000 U.S. troops are scheduled to stay through at least 2014. Obama confirms that the U.S. is holding preliminary peace talks with the Taliban leadership. With reconciliation in mind, the UN Security Council days earlier splits a sanctions list between members of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, making it easier to add and remove people and entities. Sound 17, November 2010, timetable for security transition. At a summit in Lisbon, Portugal, NATO member countries sign a declaration agreeing to hand over full responsibility for security in Afghanistan to Afghan forces by the end of 2014. The transition process is set to begin in July 2011, with local security forces taking over control in relatively stable provinces and cities. The initial handover is to coincide with the start of a drawdown in the 100,000-strong contingent of U.S. troops deployed in Afghanistan, though the number of U.S. soldiers leaving is expected to be a token amount. But many in Afghanistan and in the West, including members of the Afghan parliament, are concerned about the ability of national forces to take over from international troops. May 1, 2011, bin Laden killed. Al-Qaeda leader bin Laden, responsible for the 9/11 attacks, is killed by U.S. forces in Pakistan. The death of the United States' primary target for a war that started 10 years ago fuels the long-simmering debate about continuing the Afghanistan war. As President Obama prepares to announce the withdrawal of some or all of the 30,000 surge troops in July, congressional lawmakers increasingly call for a hastened drawdown of U.S. troops, though some analysts argue for a sustained military engagement. Meanwhile, anti-Pakistan rhetoric grows in Afghanistan, where officials have long blamed terrorist safe havens in Pakistan for violence in Afghanistan. Afghan President Karzai reiterates that international forces should focus their military efforts across the border in Pakistan. For years we have said that the fight against terrorism is not in Afghan villages and houses, he says. Sound 16, December 1, 2009, Obama's Afghan surge. 9 months after renewing the U.S. commitment to the Afghan war effort, President Obama announces a major escalation of the U.S. mission. In a nationally televised speech, the president commits an additional 30,000 forces to the fight, on top of the 68,000 in place. These forces, Obama says, will increase our ability to train competent Afghan security forces and to partner with them so that more Afghans can get into the fight. And they will help create the conditions for the United States to transfer responsibility to the Afghans. For the first time in the 8-year war effort, a time frame is put on the U.S. military presence, as Obama sets July 2011 as the start of a troop drawdown. But the president does not detail how long a drawdown will take. Obama says U.S. national interests are linked to success in the Afghan war effort, and argues that this temporary surge will force Afghan political and military institutions to assume responsibility for their own affairs. June 23, 2010, General McChrystal relieved from Afghan command. General McChrystal is relieved of his post as commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, following a controversial Rolling Stone article in which he and his aides were quoted criticizing the administration. President Obama nominates General David Petraeus, head of the military's Central Command and architect of the 2007 Iraq surge, to replace McChrystal. The change in command comes at a crucial time in the war, as additional surge forces are scheduled to arrive ahead of a critical operation in Kandahar. Obama emphasizes that his acceptance of McChrystal's resignation does not reflect disagreement over the counterinsurgency strategy he had helped shape. "We are in full agreement about our strategy," says Obama. "This is a change in personnel, not a change in policy." Sound 15, July 2009, New Strategy, Old Battles. U.S. Marines launch a major offensive in southern Afghanistan, representing a major test for the U.S. military's new counterinsurgency strategy. The offensive, involving 4,000 Marines, is launched in response to a growing Taliban insurgency in the country's southern provinces, especially Helmand Province. The operation focuses on restoring government services, bolstering local police forces, and protecting civilians from Taliban incursion. By August 2009, U.S. forces are to number between 60,000 and 68,000. November 2009, Afghan presidential election. After more than 2 months of uncertainty following a disputed presidential election on August 20, Afghan President Karzai wins another term. The August 20 election, which pitted Karzai against top contenders Abdullah Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, was marred by fraud allegations. An investigation by the UN-backed Electoral Complaints Commission finds Karzai won only 49.67% of the vote, below the 50% plus one threshold needed to avoid a runoff. Under international pressure, Karzai agrees to a runoff vote on November 7. But a week before the runoff, Karzai's main rival Abdullah pulls out, and Karzai is declared the winner. Concerns over Karzai's legitimacy grow, and the United States and other international partners call for improved governance. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton ties all future civilian aid to greater efforts by the Karzai administration to combat corruption. Sound 14, April 2009, a different call to NATO. Senior U.S. military officials and commanders, altering course from the Bush administration, call on NATO nations to supply non-military assets to Afghanistan. Officials stress the need for NATO members to step up in building Afghan civil society, such as providing resources for PRTs. A 2-day NATO summit in early April ends with a promise by NATO nations to send an additional 5,000 troops to train the Afghan army and police force, and to provide security for the country's August presidential election. May 11, 2009, command change. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates replaces the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General David D. McKiernan, with counterinsurgency and special operations guru General Stanley A. McChrystal. McKiernan's removal comes 11 months after he assumed command of NATO forces in Afghanistan. Gates says the Pentagon needs fresh thinking and fresh eyes on the Afghanistan war at a time when many analysts say operations there are spiraling out of control. Reports indicate that the appointment of McChrystal is intended to bring a more aggressive and innovative approach to the Afghan war effort in tune with a more focused counterinsurgency strategy. Sound 13, February 17, 2009, Obama recommits to Afghanistan. Newly elected U.S. President Barack Obama announces plans to send 17,000 more troops to the war zone. Obama reaffirms campaign statements that Afghanistan is the more important U.S. front against terrorist forces. He says the United States will stick to a timetable to draw down most combat forces from Iraq by the end of 2011. As of January 2009, the Pentagon has 37,000 troops in Afghanistan, roughly divided between U.S. and NATO commands. Reinforcements focus on countering a resurgent Taliban and stemming the flow of foreign fighters over the Afghan-Pakistan border in the south. Speaking on the troop increase, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates describes the original mission in Afghanistan as too broad and calls for establishing limited goals such as preventing and limiting terrorist safe havens. March 27, 2009, A New American Strategy. President Obama announces a new strategy for the war effort, linking success in Afghanistan to a stable Pakistan. The core goal of the strategy, as outlined in an interagency white paper, is to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda and its safe havens in Pakistan, and to prevent their return to Pakistan or Afghanistan. The strategy urges the passage of increased aid to Pakistan and a strict standard of measuring progress in fighting al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Plans also call for the deployment of an additional 4,000 soldiers to help train the Afghan army and police force. Afghan President Karzai welcomes the strategy, stating that the plan will bring Afghanistan and the international community closer to success. Sound 12, May 2007, a Taliban commander falls. A notorious Taliban military commander, Mullah Dadullah, is killed in a joint operation by Afghan, US, and NATO forces in the south of Afghanistan. Dadullah is believed to have been a leader of guerrilla forces in the war in Helmand province, deploying suicide bombers and ordering the kidnapping of Westerners. He once told the BBC that hundreds of suicide bombers awaited his command to launch an offensive against foreign troops. August 22, 2008, collateral killings mount. Afghan and UN investigations find that errant fire from a US gunship killed dozens of Afghan civilians in the Shindan district of western Herat province, drawing condemnation from Afghan President Karzai and bolstering Taliban claims that coalition forces are unable to protect the population. U.S. military officials dispute the death toll in this incident as well as claims that a separate incident in Farah province left as many as 140 civilians dead. After being named top U.S. commander in Afghanistan in mid-2009, General Stanley A. McChrystal orders an overhaul of U.S. airstrike procedures. We must avoid the trap of winning tactical victories, but suffering strategic defeats, by causing civilian casualties or excessive damage and thus alienating the people, the general writes. Sound 11, July 2006, a bloody resurgence. Violence increases across the country during the summer months, with intense fighting erupting in the south in July. The number of suicide attacks quintuples from 27 in 2005 to 139 in 2006, while remotely detonated bombings more than double, to 1,677. Despite a string of recent election successes, some experts blame a faltering central government for the spike in attacks. As with most insurgencies, the critical precondition to the Afghan insurgency is the collapse of governance, says Afghanistan expert Seth G. Jones. Jones and other experts point to the many Afghans who lack basic services, the government's difficulty setting up its police forces, and the lack of international forces to assist with security. November 2006, cracks in the coalition. At the NATO summit in Riga, Latvia, rifts emerge among member states on troop commitments to Afghanistan. NATO Secretary-General Yapte Hoop-Scheffer sets a target of 2008 for the Afghan National Army to begin to take control of security. I would hope that by 2008 we will have made considerable progress, he says, with a more stable political architecture in place, and with a strong interface between NATO and the civilian agencies and effective, trusted Afghan security forces gradually taking control. Leaders of the 26 countries agree to remove some national restrictions on how, when, and where forces can be used. But friction continues. With violence against non-governmental aid workers increasing, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates criticizes NATO countries in late 2007 for not sending more soldiers. Our progress in Afghanistan is real, but it is fragile, Gates says. At this time, many allies are unwilling to share the risks, commit the resources, and follow through on collective commitments to this mission and to each other. As a result, we risk allowing what has been achieved in Afghanistan to slip away. Sound 10, May 23, 2005, an enduring U.S. commitment. Afghan President Karzai and U.S. President Bush issue a joint declaration that pronounces their respective countries' strategic partners. The declaration gives U.S. forces access to Afghan military facilities to prosecute the war against international terror and the struggle against violent extremism. The alliance's goal, the agreement says, is to strengthen U.S.-Afghan ties and help ensure Afghanistan's long-term security, democracy, and prosperity. Moreover, the agreement calls for Washington to help organize, train, equip, and sustain Afghan security forces as Afghanistan develops the capacity to undertake this responsibility. And to continue to rebuild the country's economy and political democracy. September 18, 2005, Democracy in Afghanistan. More than 6 million Afghans turn out to vote for the Wolsi Jirga, Council of People, the Mashrano Jirga, Council of Elders, and local councils. Considered the most democratic elections ever in Afghanistan, nearly half those casting ballots are women, viewed as a sign of political progress in a highly patriarchal and conservative society. 68 out of 249 seats are set aside for female members of Afghanistan's lower house of parliament and 23 out of 102 are reserved in the upper house. Sound 8, August 8, 2003, an international mission. NATO assumes control of International Security Forces, ISAF, in Afghanistan, expanding NATO/ISAF's role across the country. It is NATO's first operational commitment outside of Europe. Originally tasked with securing Kabul and its surrounding areas, NATO expands in September 2005, July 2006, and October 2006. The number of ISAF troops grows accordingly, from an initial 5,000 to around 65,000 troops from 42 countries, including all 28 NATO member states. In 2006, ISAF assumes command of the international military forces in eastern Afghanistan from the US-led coalition, and also becomes more involved in intensive combat operations in southern Afghanistan. January 2004, a constitution for Afghanistan. An assembly of 502 Afghan delegates agrees on a constitution for Afghanistan, creating a strong presidential system intended to unite the country's various ethnic groups. The act is seen as a positive step toward democracy. Afghans have seized the opportunity provided by the United States and its international partners to lay the foundation for democratic institutions and provide a framework for national elections, declares U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan Zalmay Khalilzad. Sound 7, November 2002, establishing a reconstruction model. The U.S. military creates a civil affairs framework to coordinate redevelopment with the United Nations and non-governmental organizations and to expand the authority of the Kabul government. These so-called Provincial Reconstruction Teams, or PRTs, are stood up first in Gardez in November, followed by Bamiyan, Kunduz, Mazar-e-Sharif, Kandahar, and Herat. Command for individual PRTs is eventually handed over to North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, states. While credited with improving security for aid agencies, the model is not universally praised. Concern mounts that the PRT system lacks central controlling authority, is disorganized, and creates what a U.S. Institute of Peace report calls an ad hoc approach to security and development. Such criticism grows beyond the PRT program and becomes a common theme in the NATO war effort, as a maze of national caveats restricts the activities of member forces. Critics contend this limits the coalition's effectiveness. May 1, 2003, major combat over. During a briefing with reporters in Kabul, U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declares an end to major combat. The announcement coincides with President Bush's mission-accomplished declaration of an end to fighting in Iraq. Rumsfeld says President Bush, U.S. Central Command Chief General Tommy Franks, and Afghan President Karzai have concluded that we are at a point where we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction and activities. There are only 8,000 U.S. soldiers stationed in Afghanistan. It is predicted that the transition from combat to reconstruction will open the door for many aid organizations, particularly European groups, that had balked at sending troops, supplies, or other assistance. Sound 6, April 17, 2002, Reconstructing Afghanistan. President Bush calls for the reconstruction of Afghanistan in a speech at the Virginia Military Institute. By helping to build an Afghanistan that is free from this evil and is a better place in which to live, we are working in the best traditions of George Marshall, he says, evoking the post-World War II Marshall Plan that revived Western Europe. But the United States and its allies do not come close to Marshall Plan-like reconstruction spending for Afghanistan. The U.S. Congress appropriates over $38 billion in humanitarian and reconstruction assistance to Afghanistan from 2001 to 2009. June 2002, transitional government named. Chairman of the Interim Administration of Afghanistan Karzai is picked to head the country's transitional government. His selection comes during an emergency Loya Jirga assembled in Kabul, attended by 1,550 delegates, including about 200 women, from Afghanistan's 364 districts. Karzai, leader of the powerful Popalzai tribe of Durrani Pashtun, returned to Afghanistan from Pakistan after the 9/11 attacks to organize Pashtun resistance to the Taliban. Some observers allege Karzai tolerates corruption by members of his clan and his government. The Northern Alliance, dominated by ethnic Tajiks, fails in its effort to set up a prime ministership, but does succeed in checking presidential powers by assigning major authorities to the elected parliament, such as the power to veto senior official nominees and to impeach a president. Sound 5, December 9, 2001, the Taliban collapse. The end of the Taliban regime is generally tied to this date, when the Taliban surrender Kandahar, PDF, and Taliban leader Mullah Muhammad Omar flees the city, leaving it under tribal law administered by Pashtun leaders. Despite the official fall of the Taliban, however, al-Qaeda leaders continue to hide out in the mountains. March 2002, Mixed Signals, Operation Anaconda, the first major ground assault and the largest operation since Tora Bora, is launched against an estimated 800 al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters in the Shaikat Valley south of the city of Gardez, Paktia province. Nearly 2,000 U.S. and 1,000 Afghan troops battle the militants. Despite the operation's size, however, Anaconda does not represent a broadening of the war effort. Instead, Pentagon planners begin shifting military and intelligence resources away from Afghanistan in the direction of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which is increasingly mentioned as a chief U.S. threat in the war on terror. Sound 4, December 2001, Bin Laden escapes. After tracking al-Qaeda leader Bin Laden to the well-equipped Tora Bora cave complex southeast of Kabul, Afghan militias engage in a fierce two-week battle, December 3 to 17, with al-Qaeda militants. It results in a few hundred deaths and the eventual escape of Bin Laden, who is thought to have left for Pakistan on horseback on December 16, just a day before Afghan forces capture 20 of his remaining men. Despite intelligence pointing to Bin Laden's presence in Tora Bora, U.S. forces do not lead the assault, which is carried out by a ragtag Afghan contingent led by Hazrat Ali, Haji Zaman, and Haji Zahir. Some critics will later question why U.S. forces did not take a more assertive role in the engagement. December 5, 2001, an interim government. After the fall of Kabul in November 2001, the United Nations invites major Afghan factions, most prominently the Northern Alliance and a group led by the former king, but not the Taliban, to a conference in Bonn, Germany. On December 5, 2001, the factions signed the Bonn Agreement, endorsed by UN Security Council Resolution 1383. The agreement, reportedly reached with substantial Iranian diplomatic help because of Iran's support for the Northern Alliance faction, installs Hamid Karzai as interim administration head, and creates an international peacekeeping force to maintain security in Kabul. The Bonn Agreement is followed by UN Security Council Resolution 1386 on December 20, which establishes the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. Sound 3, October 7, 2001, the opening salvo, the U.S. military, with British support, begins a bombing campaign against Taliban forces, officially launching Operation Enduring Freedom. Australia, Canada, France, and Germany pledge future support. The war's early phase, PDF, mainly involves U.S. airstrikes on al-Qaeda and Taliban forces that are assisted by a partnership of about 1,000 U.S. Special Forces, the Northern Alliance, and ethnic Pashtun anti-Taliban forces. The first wave of conventional ground forces arrives 12 days later. Most of the ground combat is between the Taliban and its Afghan opponents. November 2001, the Taliban in retreat. The Taliban regime unravels rapidly after its loss at Mazar-e-Sharif on November 9, 2001, to forces loyal to Abdul Rashid Dostum, an ethnic Uzbek military leader. Over the next week, Taliban's strongholds crumble after coalition and Northern Alliance offensives on Taloqan, November 11, Bamiyan, November 11, Herat, November 12, Kabul, November 13, and Jalalabad, November 14. On November 14, the UN Security Council passes Resolution 1378, calling for a central role for the United Nations in establishing a transitional administration and inviting member states to send peacekeeping forces to promote stability and aid delivery. Sound 2, September 11, 2001, terrorists strike the U.S., al-Qaeda operatives hijack 4 commercial airliners, crashing them into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4th plane crashes in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Close to 3,000 people die in the attacks. Although Afghanistan is the base for al-Qaeda, none of the 19 hijackers are Afghan nationals. Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian, led the group, and 15 of the hijackers originated from Saudi Arabia. U.S. President George W. Bush vows to win the war against terrorism, and later zeroes in on al-Qaeda and bin Laden in Afghanistan. Bush eventually calls on the Taliban regime to deliver to the United States authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in your land or share in their fate. September 18, 2001, a war footing, President Bush signs into law a joint resolution authorizing the use of force against those responsible for attacking the United States on September 11. This joint resolution will later be cited by the Bush administration as legal rationale for its decision to take sweeping measures to combat terrorism, including invading Afghanistan, eavesdropping on U.S. citizens without a court order, and standing up the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
Thanks you for watching this video. Have more.